Hi, I'm David Crow. Thank you for tuning in to episode 227 of my weekly radio show, The Infectious Myth. Email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. That's Crow with an E. Join the discussion and like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Infectious Myth. Listen every Tuesday at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on prn.fm or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or other programs. You can listen to any of the last 5 episodes over the phone by dialing the U.S. number 701-719-0990. PRN.FM has voicemail, so call 862-800-6805. Leave a message, your name, and indicate that the question is for The Infectious Myth. If you dial either of these numbers, long-distance charges may apply. I don't know that you're a listener until I hear from you, so send me a message letting me know how you stay in touch with the show and what you like about it. If you include your mailing address, I'll send you a little thank you gift, one of the bookmarks I make by hand using my own photographs. I do really love to hear from you, my listeners. Don't be shy. You can make a one-time donation to the expenses of the show via PayPal using the email david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com or monthly donations at patreon.com or liberapay.com where we're Infectious Myth, one word. We appreciate all our listeners, but if you want this show to continue to grow and improve, consider paying a small amount for the information that you're gleaning, for the support you get for some non-mainstream ideas and the challenges to others. If you'd like me to speak at a meeting of an organization you're a member of on any topic that you think I have an interesting and worthwhile opinion on, I'd be happy to discuss this with you. And now let's go to this week's interview. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to KZSC Santa Cruz 88.1 that is hosting my guest today at no charge. W. Jackson Davis, PhD, was educated at UC Berkely, the University of Oregon, and Stanford. He received a PhD in 1967 and was appointed as the youngest professor in the University of California system in 1968 when he joined the faculty at the University of California at Santa Cruz. In 1995, he took on an additional role when appointed as Gordon Paul Smith Professor of International Environmental Policy at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. Davis was the founding head of the International Environmental Policy Program at the Monterey Institute. He was trained originally in the neurosciences and won the prestigious Humboldt Prize for his research in this area, but turned to environmental science and policy in 1980. From then until 2000, he represented small island Pacific states in the United Nations, from where he participated in all of the negotiations leading to both the UN Climate Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, among several other landmark treaties and conventions. He was scientific advisor to the Alliance of Small Island States during this period, in which capacity he wrote the AOSIS negotiating brief that has been described as the first draft of the Kyoto Protocol. It's posted online along with his CV at the website environmentalstudiesinstitute.org. In 2017, he published a paper that's attracted considerable attention across disciplines entitled The Relationship Between Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide Concentration and Global Temperature for the Last 425 Million Years, which was the stimulus for today's interview. There he showed that carbon dioxide was not the cause of temperature change throughout most of known climate history. A second paper published in 2018 described a natural climate cycle that he describes as the possible cause of the contemporary global warming signal. I'll put links to these 2 papers in the show notes. Welcome to the show, Jackson.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you very much for having me on your program.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure. I'd just like to start by asking you, I've given some of your background, but exactly how and why did you get involved in climate science?
Well, David, it kind of happened in stages. First through teaching at the 2 universities where I worked then, and then in negotiating the Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol. I had to have a very firm grasp of climate science in order to do that competently. Now, my motivation at the time was to help island people protect themselves from global warming and from sea level rise, which I thought were caused by other people. Pacific Island states were literally sinking beneath the waves, and I thought that this loss of culture and the loss of homelands was simply immoral. I thought it was caused by carbon dioxide emitted by the industrial countries, which should do something about it. That, as you know, that's the so-called anthropogenic global warming hypothesis, which I embraced quite completely at the time. Later, 20 years later, my motivation to study climate has changed quite radically. I began to doubt the anthropogenic global warming hypothesis, and I was sickened as my research gradually confirmed those doubts. I came to understand that I had taught the wrong climate science to a whole generation of students and helped to develop international climate policy based on what I now consider to be a theory that is incorrect.
Can you expand on what were a few of the things that caused you to question the dominant anthropogenic global warming theory?
Oh, yes, very definitely. First of all, some of the key papers that supported that theory were discredited in the early 2000s. And when I saw that, I was chagrined because one in particular was why I thought for sure that anthropogenic global warming was correct. Turned out that that paper was done improperly and it was exposed. The other thing, and this was the major motivation, my friend and colleague Peter Taylor just published a book in 2005, and he asked me to read the draft in the early 2000s, which is called Chill, still available on Amazon. And he reassesses global warming theory there and claimed that it's caused not by carbon dioxide, but by natural climate cycles. Now, I thought my dear friend had lost his marbles, but when I read his book and then continued my research, I gradually confirmed that he was right, although for the wrong reasons, as it turns out.
Yes. So what are the most important questions we should be asking about climate science? And, well, first of all, I mean, do you believe that there is a trend of global warming over, say, the past century?
Oh, very definitely, yeah. The instrumental records show that, actually. And so I don't think there's any doubt that the Earth is warming. The only real question is why. Why is it getting warmer? And that's where I differ with the climate establishment.
Okay. Maybe, and in your research has, as your research has gone on and you've become more skeptical about anthropogenic global warming, how would you say that you've seen the range of views held by scientists? Like, for example, it's often said that 97% of climate scientists believe in anthropogenic global warming. What have you seen in terms of what scientists think about the warming and the cause?
I would corroborate that 97% figure, but I also would note that that's 97% of scientists who were at the time actively publishing in climate science. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, publishing climate scientists think that humans cause global warming because nobody who thinks anything else can get their work financed or published. So it's kind of a selected data set, if you will. There are some skeptics in the field, but by and large they are ignored, and they have a hard time publishing their most direct and truthful stuff as well.
Yes, well, we'll talk very soon about your 2017 paper because I thought it was extremely interesting, but it's obviously could be seen as they often refer to people who question anything about anthropogenic global warming as denialists. It could be seen as a denialist paper. Did you have any difficulty getting it published? And did you need any grant funding in order to do the research?
Well, yeah, first of all, if I may question just a bit the term denialist, that is widely misused, I believe, to characterize climate skeptics. Climate skeptics do not deny that the world is warming. All you have to do is watch the nightly news, and you have no doubt of that. Climate denialists or skeptics deny that carbon dioxide is the cause. They think that other things cause it, and that's a more accurate portrayal of climate skeptics. Now, did I have trouble getting my work published? Well, yes, definitely. In fact, I went through 24 straight rejections of my submitted papers. Not a single rejection, as far as I could tell, for any valid scientific reason. So I had a terrible time getting it published, and many of the reviewers were quite pointed and even personal in their rejections. So anybody who has a skeptical view of the current paradigm has an awful time getting it published. And as far as finances are concerned, you can forget it. If you can't do this work on your own, then it doesn't get done.
Okay, so you published in 2017 in the journal Climate. I don't know the climate journals. Is it a serious journal? Is it peer-reviewed? Like how does it rank with other journals in the field?
Well, David, full disclosure first. After my first paper on atmospheric carbon dioxide was published by the journal, the editors invited me to join the editorial board of the journal. The fact that I accepted shows that I think that the journal is entirely legitimate.
Okay. So anybody who, people would say, oh, well, now you have a conflict of interest. But in your opinion, this is a serious journal, and I'm going to take your work seriously. And you're going back, I think I said 425 million years. Is that correct? That's how long back?
That is correct. That is correct.
So we obviously can't go back with instrumentation 425 million years. So you talk about the use of CO2 proxies. So what is a proxy that could be used to estimate CO2 levels 425 million years ago or in the intervening years?
Good question, David. To begin with, a proxy is a stand-in. Mm-hmm. It's a variable that is not itself carbon dioxide or temperature or any other climate variable, but it bears a demonstrable, direct, linear relationship to it. You can think of a proxy as a faithful facsimile of past climate variables. Mm-hmm. Now, I used measured carbon dioxide in gas bubbles trapped in ice cores as a proxy for more recent carbon dioxide levels. For the more ancient times that you mentioned, the carbon dioxide proxies that I relied upon, which are, by the way, the work of other people, not my own,
right,
are carbon-13, carbon-13, plant stomatal indices and ratios, marine boron, and sodium carbonates. And again, these proxies are based on consensual data collected and validated by other scientists. I truly, in this case, stand on the shoulders of giants.
And, can you describe one of them? So carbon-13 is an isotope of carbon, which means it has a different number of neutrons than most carbon atoms.
Exactly.
So how is it used to estimate the amount of CO2, say, in ancient sediments? Like, where would you get this CO2 from, or where would you get this carbon-13 from, and what can you derive? What knowledge can you derive from that?
Well, carbon-13 is just one of many. I think the one that I use probably the most is the ratio of oxygen-16 to oxygen-18 in seashells. That's a really ingenious technique. Shall I describe that to you?
Yeah. And so oxygen, what I know is that oxygen doesn't really have a large quantity of isotopes. They're at very, very low levels. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
But oxygen, O16 and O18 are two that exist. So, can you describe it a little bit more?
Yeah. They exist in seawater, and their ratio is therefore reflected in anything that lives in the sea and produces a long-term record, such as seashells. So you measure the oxygen isotope ratio, and it turns out that is precisely linearly related to the temperature at the time that seashell was formed. So the only thing you need to know now is how old it is, and that is, in this case, determined by radioactive dating, developed in the early 1900s, and is extremely ingenious and also very, very rigorous.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a shell. Let's go through it. So a shell falls to the bottom of the sea, hundreds of millions of years ago. There's oxygen within the shell itself.
Yes, there is.
And over time, are the isotopes radioactive?
No, they're not radioactive, and so they don't decay themselves. But when water evaporates from the ocean, it leaves behind preferentially the heavier oxygen-18. So the warmer it gets, the more oxygen-18 you see in seashells.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That can be calibrated in a laboratory by laboratory experiments, and has been, and it's extremely precise. And so also are the dating methods. So the only real question is whether the value of the data declines over time. And that has been the subject of quite a bit of research, and practically all scientists who've studied the issue now think that there's very little of what is called diagenetic settling. There is very little change in those ratios. So they're considered quite accurate. And they correlate well with other measures that we use as well.
Okay, so what's the importance of the O16 then?
Well, O16 is just one of the two. It's left behind, it's evaporated preferentially when it gets warmer. And so then, as water vapor, it gets incorporated to ice, and that same oxygen isotope ratio can be extracted from stable water isotopes and used to date ice cores as well, or used to determine, I should say, what's in ice cores. Dating is a different matter.
Right. So O18 is a temperature proxy, but what about CO2?
I should say that it's that ratio. O18 itself is not a proxy. It's that ratio which is the proxy.
Of 16 to 18.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay. So we've established that. So now give me a CO2 proxy.
Okay, let's take fossilized plants.
Mm-hmm.
You know that a leaf of a plant has some little pores called stomata in it. And those stomata are where the plant ingests or breathes carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is in turn, that's the plant's food, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out the more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the more stomata there are on the surface of specific species of plant leaves.
Okay.
Right? So that can be calibrated too. You can now find the fossil leaf, count the density of the stomata, and that in turn is a very strong linear proxy for carbon dioxide at the time.
I'm surprised there would be more stomata, because stomata are the pores through which the air goes so that the plant can extract the CO2 with the help of chlorophyll. You'd think there would be more when there was less CO2, when it needed more air.
Actually, now that you mention that, it does make sense, and I hope I have the number right, more rather than less. What I typically do in using proxies is simply look at the CO2 level to which they've translated.
Oh, okay. So somebody else did the research count. I can't imagine that counting stomata in fossilized plant leaves is a whole lot of fun. So some graduate students presumably spent hundreds of hours doing this in order to get their thesis, and from that we get some data about CO2 levels over ancient times.
Well, that's true. As for graduate students, I've got to tell you that I have spent hundreds of hours doing almost equally routine data crunching tasks in order to provide the basis for the papers that I published.
Yes, I mean, that's actually an interesting point, because science is not just based on theories and theorizing, but it's really based, you often can't do that unless you have huge quantities of data, and gathering huge quantities of data can be a very tedious process.
That's an extremely important point, David, and I think is actually central to why, people have asked me, if this is true, what you're saying in print now, why hasn't somebody else studied it? And I think I know the answer. Most professors, and indeed most postdoctoral and even graduate students, just aren't willing to sit down and plot temperature data for as long as I have, and then look at the details of it to try to extract patterns. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, my brain likes to do that, and so I don't have any problem spending hours doing that, and did. And that, I think, actual knowledge of the details of the data is exactly why I came to the insights that I did.
Mm-hmm. So over time, we now have CO2 levels and temperature. One more question regarding the proxies. If you have multiple
Please.
proxies, can they be used to cross-validate each other? I mean, are you getting the same CO2 levels approximately from different proxies at the same time?
Oh, that's a very good question, and the answer is yes, you do, and that's one of the reasons that we have confidence in them. There are multiple proxies for almost every major climate variable. Temperature, for example, another one that I use a lot in ice cores is deuterium levels, because deuterium is heavier than normal hydrogen is, and as a consequence, the deuterium excess is linear in any sample of ice, is exactly and linearly related to the temperature at the time that the ice was formed. So deuterium proxies correlate very well with oxygen proxies, O18 proxies. And that's one of the reasons why we have so much confidence in their reliability.
Right. I mean, there's not a guarantee, but that's pretty strong evidence, because if they're wrong, that implies there's a third thing that's relating them, which would be unlikely.
Well, it's even better than that, because once you suspect that something is a proxy, you can do laboratory experiments. You can evaporate water, for example, and see how much oxygen 18 and oxygen 16 are in the evaporated sample, and then relate that directly to temperature. So you can prove in a laboratory that the proxy works exactly like the science says that it should.
Right. Well, I mean, that's interesting, because with a lot of historical things, there's no possibility of doing experiments. Like, you can't look at ancient animals and plants in fossils and, rebuild them in the laboratory. That's just something you might like to do, but you just don't have enough information.
Very true. And still, we can't do controlled experiments on climate. This is strictly observational science. I should say that the whole field of paleoclimatology, which began in the middle of the last century, depends entirely upon these proxies, has developed them extremely carefully. There are literally dozens of so-called paleothermometers, different ways to look at temperature from the past. So it's essentially it's the basis of an entire field, and I think the data are as beyond reproach as any data in any science that I have been experienced with.
Right. Okay, so we have CO2 and temperature, and then the big question is, are they always correlated, and is it always a positive correlation?
Well, if CO2 were responsible for causing temperature change, then you would expect a strong correlation. And I think that's where some of the confusion has come, actually. Do you remember Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth?
Definitely, yes.
He showed a graph with carbon dioxide going up and temperature going up, and then carbon dioxide going down and temperature going down. And he intoned those very words. Carbon dioxide goes up, temperature goes up. Carbon dioxide goes down, temperature goes down. And from that, he inferred that carbon dioxide was driving the temperature.
Right.
But as you point out, correlation is not causality. What's happened here is correlation has become confused with causality. In fact, it's not the carbon dioxide that causes the temperature, it's the other way around. The temperature goes up, and that releases carbon dioxide from a warming sea, because carbon dioxide is less soluble in water when it's warmer. So it's
that's interesting. I would have thought CO2 was more soluble with, most things are more soluble with temperature. Is that
I know that's odd, and I've actually tried to figure out why that is, and I never have. But it is stated universally in the field, and I have actually looked up scientific papers on it, and they say the same thing. So I'm quite sure it's correct.
Okay.
I just don't really understand why.
Well, I'm no chemist, so I'm not going to dispute that. So you're saying as the sea warms up, CO2 will be released. So then the temperature will be first, and then the CO2. Now,
well, that's the other thing. People have looked closely at the phase relationships between temperature and carbon dioxide for this most recent climate. That's what the Al Gore data pertain to. And shown that the temperature goes up before the carbon dioxide goes up. So that places temperature in the causal role. Now, that doesn't mean that carbon dioxide plays no role. I actually suggested that it does provide a positive feedback during natural glacial cycling, during the early stages of temperature increase. But the thing about carbon dioxide is that when there's more of it in the atmosphere, it has less and less effect, diminishing returns. And those diminishing returns, that falls off very quickly. So by the time carbon dioxide reaches the level of maybe 280 parts per million by volume, it's no longer very effective in causing warming.
Now, as it gets warmer and there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, my naive thought would be that plants would start to absorb more and more of the CO2 because warmer temperatures and CO2 are two of the things plants need. As long as you've got some water, then plants will grow better.
True.
So is there any evidence that this occurs, that after warming occurs, the plants start to take CO2 out of the atmosphere?
Well, they can take it out faster, but I think, I don't know exactly how to answer your question, but I think it is that the ocean, is the major reservoir of carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. And so although plants count, they don't count nearly as much as the ocean does.
Okay, which is also another problem with current thoughts about science, is that people tend not to run the numbers. And so they're maybe comparing two things, one of which is an insignificant factor and one is a major factor, but unless you have the numbers on them, you don't really know. And maybe that's why my question was naive, right? I'm thinking of plants, but as humans, we tend to think of what's on land, but there's more water surface area on the planet than there is land surface area. And
that's right. I've forgotten the percentage, but it's a huge percentage of the CO2 on Earth that's tied up in the oceans. The atmosphere is really a rather small reservoir by comparison.
Yeah, the atmosphere and also the plants.
And also plants, yeah. Exactly.
If you get up into space, you realize that the biosphere is insignificant in terms of its size. It's very significant in terms of our lives. But the further you get from the Earth, the less significant it seems.
Well, except I know you're aware that plants, as they breathe carbon dioxide, they produce oxygen. Mm-hmm. And that is why we can breathe. That's why we can live on this planet. Did you know that phytoplankton in the ocean produce about half of that oxygen?
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's a huge proportion. People aren't really aware of that. That's one of the reasons why we have a vested interest in keeping the oceans alive. They're enabling us to breathe. And
phytoplankton are plants, right? So they absorb CO2 and they produce hydrocarbons. Do they also have a skeleton of some kind?
Some of them do, yeah. And some of them, actually, those skeletons are some of the sources for the oxygen isotope ratios that I mentioned to you. So it's not just seashells, but also phytoplankton as well.
Right, and that would be, those skeletons contain carbon, right?
They do.
So that would fall to the bottom of the ocean and get taken out of the cycle for a long time.
Yeah, well, it would, but as soon as they die, then of course they don't secrete any more skeleton, and at the time of their death, those proxies inside their skeletons are a very faithful representation of the temperature during their life.
Right. So looking at your paper, looking at the graphs, this is sort of my very rough assessment. So I saw a rapid decline in carbon dioxide from about 450 million years before present to 300 million years, and then an increase in carbon dioxide levels from 250 million years before present to 200, and then a slow decline since then. Is that a sort of a rough is that an accurate assessment of your graph?
You're reading the graphs exactly right, David.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Some of that carbon dioxide fluctuation is associated with known geological events, like volcanic eruptions, seafloor spreading, or some other natural phenomenon. But mostly, we really just don't understand the reasons for such fluctuations, and in particular, there's quite a bit of debate about why carbon dioxide has declined so steadily over the past 500 million years, really. There are hypotheses, but there are no direct answers.
Right, right. So, how do volcanoes and seafloor spreading change the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere?
In both cases, gases are emitted from the mantle, along with the magma that we're familiar with in volcanoes. Mm-hmm. And those gases, they include sulfur, nitrous oxides, and lots of carbon dioxide. In fact, that is the dominant component of volcanic emission gas. And that carbon dioxide, if it's released into the ocean, like during seafloor spreading, diffuses to the surface and is released into the atmosphere. And that's how volcanic events, for example, get CO2 into the atmosphere.
Yes. You also talk quite a bit about cycles of temperature. And what kinds of time frames are we looking at first? And I'll ask you what you think the cycle's related to.
Okay. If I may, I'll begin with the carbon dioxide cycle, which I discovered and reported in my 2018 paper. Every 15 million years or so, there's a large pulse of carbon dioxide that had not been known before. And it turns out that pulse of carbon dioxide may well be related to seafloor spreading. Nobody really knows, and there's no way to tell, but it's so large and so regular that it has to be some kind of geological phenomenon, and seafloor spreading is likely. But here's the thing, David. When those CO2 pulses take place, they almost exactly coincide with mass extinctions of the past, as determined by other investigators. Mm-hmm. So what may be happening is the seafloor spreads, that it releases CO2 into the ocean, that acidifies the ocean, and that ocean acidification is what causes the mass extinctions of sea life. That's one of the reasons why I think, even though carbon dioxide, in my opinion, does not cause warming, it may cause ocean acidification, which therefore, again, in my view, still requires regulation of the emissions of carbon dioxide.
Okay. So that's interesting. So even if your hypothesis is correct that it's not carbon dioxide driving temperature changes, you still see carbon dioxide as a damaging chemical in the atmosphere.
I think it's potentially the cause of mass extinctions of the past, and we're actually approaching levels of carbon dioxide consistent with what the levels were at during those past mass extinctions. So yes, I do think it's worthwhile to keep regulating carbon dioxide until we're absolutely certain that it doesn't cause mass extinctions of the past. And even so, if we're interested in conservation, if we want to preserve fossil fuels, for example, for our grandchildren, there is some reason to go easy on them now. They're finite resources. They're not going to be around for long. So the less we use, the more our grandkids will have to use. And the more we regulate carbon dioxide, the more conservation will automatically take place.
Yes, I've long thought that the best source of energy is energy conservation. The energy you don't use because you do things smarter seems like the best possible energy.
No question about it.
Yes. So let's talk some more about some of these cycles, temperature cycles as well. Like, what are some of the things you think cause cycles of either CO2 or temperature?
Well, you're absolutely right. Temperature cycles are critical, and believe it or not, that's an area that seems to be neglected in contemporary climate science. Even though it's just obvious when you look at any temperature record from the past, there are all kinds of cycles at work. They haven't really been incorporated that thoroughly into the thinking of climate scientists, with the exception of the big ice ages that occur every 100,000 years or so. That cycle we understand very well, and everybody quite agrees that it's happening. But there are cycles that are millions of years long, tens of thousands of years long, all the way down to weeks long. They're just cycles everywhere. And the more you look, the more cycles you find. The one that I found in the Antarctic, I call the Antarctic Centennial Oscillation, and it had not been described before as a paleoclimate cycle. Anyway, it happens every 100 years or so. It peaks, and that peak is happening right now.
And what is a peak of? Peak of temperature, or
it's a temperature peak. That's right. It's been warming since about 1870, something like that. And we've reached a peak now. And the majority of the field thinks we're just going to keep on warming because carbon dioxide is the cause. I think we're going to cool imminently. The globe is going to cool down because of this cycle. And when it does, then I think that'll be I guess you would say the gold standard test of my hypothesis when it actually starts to happen.
Eventually, we'll have enough data for enough years to really know what was, to really look at the predictions that were made. Eventually, we'll have predictions that were made a century ago. I mean, I won't be around at that time, but somebody will be looking at those and seeing which ones worked out and which ones did not work out.
Very true. Very, very true.
Now,
the thing is, you need about 20 years of data before you can be confident in any trend in climate. But we should see the cooling start pretty soon. I would say the cooling itself will begin in 10 or 20 years, and it will be obvious to all 10 or 20 years after that.
Yes, but some of these cycles are thousands of years. So, I mean, from our point of view, those cycles would be invisible at the present day. We can see them historically, but we really can't. If we're in a 1,000-year cycle of temperature or CO2, we could not really see that evidence in real time.
Well, you're right. It's hard to see a cycle that lasts for so long in the present. On the other hand, we can look at cycles of the past and we can see how regular they were, and on that basis predict when the next cycle will take place. Mm-hmm. And those predictions are pretty ironclad in my opinion, because the cycles are so very regular. That's true of the Antarctic Centennial Oscillation that I discovered and think causes global warming. It goes up and down every 100 years or so, and that's exactly what temperature has done as well.
So I was reading recently that, or maybe it was in one of your papers, that at different places, say in the Antarctic, the temperature cycles were occurring at somewhat different times. I think we're all currently thinking that we're on the globe and global warming is a global phenomenon, therefore everywhere on the globe is getting warmer. I mean, historically, does the data show that at some times one part was getting warmer while another part was getting colder, indicating that it's more of a local phenomenon?
Yes and no. The yes part is the cycle that I discovered is first visible on the east coast of Antarctica, but it doesn't actually show up on the East Antarctic Plateau up at 12,000 feet until about 1,000 years later. And it follows a very specific path around Antarctica. You can actually trace it, as I do in my 2018 paper. And so, yes, warming does occur at different times at the drill stations in Antarctica. And the same is true globally. Something that starts in the Antarctic may take a long time to spread north, up to a millennium or so. So there are these time lags, but once you understand the cycles and how those cycles behave, then you understand the time lags as well.
Some people have said that these cycles are due to the sun, planetary orbits. Like, what are your hypotheses on the influences on our planet that come from outside that can cause these cycles, or are there internal factors that cause the cycles?
Both, actually. Yeah, you put your you just described the full range of causes. They are external to the Earth and they are internal to the Earth. External ones include, probably the best known one is variations in the amount of sunlight that reaches the surface of the Earth that has caused when the Earth wiggles in its orbit around the sun. And that's what's responsible for the so-called Milankovitch cycles that drive the great ice ages, the ones that happen every 80 to 120,000 years. Other cycles, like the one I discovered, the Antarctic Centennial Oscillation, they, I think, result from the Earth's internal response to external inputs. They're kind of like a pendulum or a spring. You put some energy in from the outside and they oscillate all by themselves owing to their internal properties. And figuring out those internal properties is the topic of a paper that is now under review in Climate.
Okay. So after you managed to get your 2017 paper published, what was the response? Did people ignore it? Were people agreeing with it, criticizing it, going crazy?
I would say the reception has been mixed. The papers, as I mentioned, were rejected more than 24 times by leading climate journals over a period of almost a decade before finally that first paper was published by Climate. The thing is, not one of those rejections was based upon what I consider to be a valid scientific reason, and many of them were frankly hostile, some of them even pointedly personal. By the way, I retain all of the correspondence, and they make extremely interesting historical reading.
Yes.
See, what I think is happening is a paradigm shift in climate science. I'm certainly not primarily responsible for it. A lot of people before me have been skeptics and published their thoughts, but once you are a skeptic, it's really hard to get stuff published. On the other hand, once they are published, my papers have set records for the amount of attention that they have got from readers. The carbon dioxide paper that prompted this interview has been downloaded by almost 30,000 visitors, and that sets a record for the altmetric rating system for scientific publications. Oh. So finally the work is at least getting the exposure that I had hoped it would. I thought I'd go to the grave with it, but here it is.
You mentioned seafloor spreading, and I don't know what you know about the theory of continental drift and what's now called plate tectonics, but between the time it was first expounded in around 1913 by Alfred Wegener that the continents were moving, it was rejected by geologists vociferously up until about the early 1960s. And if you were a geologist, you could not publish anything on the continents moving. Only outside of the field of geology. And then all of a sudden, in the early 1960s, the whole thing flipped. Some of the most vigorous proponents had aged out and were retiring and dying. And then within the decade of the 1960s, by the end of the decade, plate tectonics, which was renamed, continental drift renamed with a sexier name, was the dominant theory. It seems like a remarkable parallel to what's happening in climate science.
It's actually, in my opinion, it's a perfect parallel. It shows what Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm shift, and there, over a 60 or 70-year period, which is fast, by the way, for a paradigm shift, you see the entire set of assumptions and beliefs of scientists changing and flipping into a whole new mode, and now we know plate tectonics is real, not the figment of somebody's imagination.
Right.
I think the same thing may well happen in climate science, and I think that my papers will play some small role in that process.
Okay, well, let's go to, you read, some people claim, this is a bizarre complaint, that there's not enough coverage of what they're now calling the climate catastrophe in the newspapers. But I seem to be saturated with every time I look at a newspaper or go onto the website of a major news outlet, BBC, CNN, CBC in Canada, whatever, there's always a climate article.
Oh, it's daily.
Yes. So The Guardian, a very respected British newspaper, said that by 2050, the climate of London will just be like the climate of Barcelona today, which actually I think would be a good thing. But anyway, I mean, what do you think about predictions like that?
Well, it would make Winnipeg more livable, wouldn't it?
Yes.
But, and I think they are consistent with the current paradigm, which essentially extrapolates temperature increase into the more or less indefinite future. They are inconsistent with my work. I forecast that the climate in London in 2050 will be more like the climate of Oslo or Stockholm today. And those northern cities, they'll be even colder than they are today.
NASA reported significant greening in China and India over the past 20 years. So two explanations I can think of are that there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, or agricultural practices are getting better. There's been action against deforestation and things like that. Do you know anything about this?
I don't, David. It is true that warmer global temperatures are more conducive to plant growth. And it's also true that warmer temperatures make water evaporate faster, which makes more rainfall, which also contributes to plant growth. And carbon dioxide is a great fertilizer. When it goes up in concentration, plants grow faster too. And so these forces may all underlie greening in certain parts of the Earth, but I really don't know whether that's the cause of what NASA has noticed.
Yes. I'm sure you've noticed too that there seems to be some bias in coverage of weather. If it's hot like it was recently in Europe, I think France broke a record of over 40 degrees Celsius, 100 and something Fahrenheit, or at least Paris, somewhere in Paris. But then shortly after there was a cold snap, and they had frost in Germany and Holland in July, which is also unheard of. Have you noticed that the coverage seems to amplify the hot and mute the cold?
Yes, I have. I've paid close attention to that, as you might imagine. Now, generally, I must say the media are doing a good job in one thing, and that is staying fairly neutral on the meaning of a hot or a cold snap and how they relate to current global warming. At least the outlets that I watch do. We can't generally tell whether any particular weather event is related to global warming, although that seems likely to me. Besides, when climate changes, extreme events, both cold and warm, are more common. And so the cold events like the German July frost are not evidence against global warming. They are rather an expected consequence of it.
So you're saying that, okay, the temperature is warming. I've never quite understood this, how there seems to have been over the last 10 years a lot of cold weather events. I think 2010 had like an extremely cold winter in the UK and also in China. How is that related to global warming? Or, how is a colder temperature related to hotter temperatures?
When you have warm extremes like we do, the contrast with the poles becomes greater, and that in turn creates more extreme weather of both kinds, both hot and cold. On the other hand, the cooling that I foresee as beginning imminently would also be expected to create colder winters, more snowfall, etc. So I can't tell myself whether this is evidence of my hypothesis unwinding, being shown to us by nature, or whether this is still a consequence of the global warming. That's why it takes 20 years of data to actually tell whether the change is taking place.
Yes, and certainly some of the predictions from 20 years ago that were for years that have already passed have proven to be wrong. Like, people made many predictions that there would be no snow in Australia anymore, and they just recently had a very cold winter, with the ski resorts having a great season.
Very true.
It wasn't that long ago they said that, the Alps and other places, just ski resorts would be going out of business, and that hasn't happened.
That's true. And the other thing that has happened is, and you've probably heard of this, the warming hiatus, meaning a pause. A number of scientists noticed that the rate at which warming is increasing began to decline around 2000, and that rate is still declining, even though records are still being broken. And that, of course, is exactly what you expect to happen at the peak of a warming cycle, the very cycle that I discovered and that I predict will cause cooling to begin imminently.
Oh, right. Like if you were to go up into the air in a rocket, you would experience the feeling of moving fast earlier in the going up, and when you get towards the top, you would be at the highest point, but you would feel weightless, not like you're going up at all, and you're not. But you'd still be at the highest point.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor. Yeah, we may be at the highest point right now, and it may be the cooling that I foresee may be beginning right now.
Okay, so let's try to be a bit more practical. On the basis of what you've concluded about the climate, what actions should we be taking about CO2 or about burning fossil fuels or anything else?
Oh boy, now there's... How much time do you have, David?
We got about 5 minutes. I can push it 5 minutes.
Okay.
Not 5 days.
Well, I'll do bullet points then. How's that?
Yeah, okay.
First of all, in the transition from fossil fuels, I actually wrote a book on that topic published by Norton in 1979 called The Seventh Year. And that title is based on the fact that Joseph had this dream that 7 years of plenty would be followed by a 7th year of, or 6 years of plenty would be followed by a 7th year of famine. And that's kind of where we're at on fossil fuels right now. They're going to run out, and the question is when. So we should be thinking about renewables, no question about that. And we should be even subsidizing them, in my opinion, if they are, if they're not economically competitive yet. Secondly, and here's the main message that I have, we have to get ready for the coming global cooling. I feel very urgent about it, and it's one of the big reasons that I am so anxious to get the word out on my findings. Food is going to be harder to grow. It's going to be harder to stay warm, especially in northerly latitudes like Canada and the northern U.S. It'll also be much drier, with most fresh water frozen up in expanded glaciers and ice caps. So we need to get ready for that cooling. Can you imagine what would happen if we couldn't grow corn, wheat, and rice anymore in the volumes that we can? 80% of human calories come from those three grains. If shorter growing seasons make it so we can't harvest the same amount, we're in for a food calamity, and that's, I think, what has me the most concerned. Third, let's continue to regulate carbon dioxide for the reasons that I mentioned, acidification and also conservation. Fourth, and this will be controversial, I know, to some listeners, I think we should support the responsible use of all available fossil fuels. Coal in particular has become almost a dirty word, and it's true that soft coal is dirty, and burning it emits pollutants, but it can be cleaned up, and it can also last for 1,500 years at current levels of usage. It's our most abundant fossil fuel, and I think we have to keep the infrastructure alive for using it when push comes to shove, which I think is coming pretty soon. Fifth, I like the idea of exploring new options for fossil fuels like Alberta oil sands. When it comes really cold in the next few decades, and especially in 4 centuries, when I predict the recurrence of a little ice age, we're going to be very happy to have the option of Canadian oil sands. Sixth, let's develop renewable sources of energy. They can't hurt. They can help make fossil fuels last longer, and sooner or later, that's the only thing we're going to actually get. And seventh, and this is kind of a unique feeling, I think we can get over the Puritan guilt that we feel about climate change. I don't think we caused it. I think that nature did. And what nature is asking us to do now is to adapt to what she's handing us and to thrive.
Well, those are all thought-provoking. We could talk about them for a long time. That's for sure, time that we don't have. I've often thought that, when there are floods or there's forest fires or things like that, the most sensible thing to do is to actually say, okay, how do we mitigate the problem in the future, not how do we make it go away, because I don't think you can ever make it go away. The earth is far too dynamic. You can build cities so that they don't flood so easily, and you can build towns so that you don't have trees so close to the towns, things like that, that don't depend on the cause. They just depend on reacting to a phenomenon that you don't like, but is going to occur no matter what you do.
That's a really good point, David. And it's interesting that you raised the issue of forest fires. You know how everybody complains that global warming caused by people is what's causing forest fires? If you dig down almost anywhere on Earth in a forest, every 100 years is a thick charcoal layer.
Mm-hmm.
It exactly corresponds to the warm periods of my Antarctic Centennial Oscillation, and it's driven by nature. It gets hot and dry and things burn. That happens all the time. So when we try to negate that or mitigate that, we're fighting upstream. What we need to do is let it burn. It's part of the natural life cycle, and just don't build our houses there. That's the problem. We've put our structures in nature, in harm's way, delivered by nature.
Yeah, I think Paradise, California was a perfect example of that, where you had house, tree, house, tree. I mean, it was beautiful, but it was an accident waiting to happen. And when it burned, the whole town was destroyed. It was almost inevitable.
Yes.
It's amazing they went so long without it happening.
I feel the same way, and very sad for the people. I think 80 people died,
Mm-hmm. It was
and
tragic.
lots lost their homes. But PG&E got blamed for it. Did you know that? The power generating.
And they may have been the cause, but it's kind of like it probably would have happened from lightning or something if it hadn't been power line.
Exactly. They weren't responsible for the underlying drying of the forests and the underlying powerful winds that drove those fires. Something would have started it, whether it's lightning or a careless camper or something. But, we humans, we need to blame everything on somebody, and I guess PG&E has got it this time.
Yeah, like if forests don't burn, then the amount of fuel builds up. And, at some point, there's going to be a fire, and the longer it goes on, the worse the fire will be.
Very true. And also, and I know you know this given your scientific background, many plants in the forest absolutely require fire in order to generate the next generation.
Yeah, like the pine cones that don't open until they're heated.
Exactly.
Yes.
So
anyway,
those fires are part of nature.
We have gone through our time, and I would just like to thank you very much for joining me today to talk about historical CO2 and temperatures. And also I'd like to thank KZSC Santa Cruz 88.1 that hosted you today. Very grateful to them as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, David. It's been a real pleasure to be on your show.
Okay, thank you and goodbye.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to episode 227 of The Infectious Myth. If you have a comment, question, or suggestion for a future guest, please email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. Like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth or join the discussion there. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at InfectiousMyth. Commit to monthly donations of any amount to Infectious Myth, one word, on patreon.com or liberapay.com. Until next week, thank you and goodbye.